We are Team 9, including Chad Green, Jillian King, Curtis Coling, Wesley Miller, and Brooke Newroth. We are going to talk about the defining moment of biotechnology, how Jesse Gelsinger prompted the reevaluation of bioethics in gene therapy.
Where do you get 100 million year old dinosaur blood? Shh.
What? Oh, it's the DNA. Where did you come from?
From your blood. Just one drop of your blood contains billions of strands of DNA, the building blocks of life. A DNA strand, like me, is a blueprint for building a living thing. And sometimes animals that went extinct millions of years ago, like dinosaurs, left their blueprints behind for us to find.
So it may be a bit different than the Jurassic Park example, but human gene therapy is a real thing. Gene therapy is the insertion of normal DNA from another human directly into cells to correct a genetic defect of some kind. The treatment of disease by replacing, altering, or supplementing a gene that is absent or normal and whose absence or abnormality is responsible for a disease defines human gene therapy. So the study we want to talk about specifically was with regards to Jesse Gelsinger. Every realm of medicine has its defining moment, often with a human face attached. Polio had Jonas Salk, AIDS had Magic Johnson, now gene therapy has Jesse Gelsinger. Jesse Gelsinger had a genetic mutation. It was defined as a hybrid phenotype, meaning it wasn't inherited. It was something that his body specifically had as compared to inheriting it from his parents. He had ornithine transcarbamylase, OTC deficiency, and managed it safely with medication and diet. And OTC deficiency causes excessive ammonia in the body, which can lead to death. He was recruited for a new gene therapy study at the age of 17 that was supposed to help support infantile OTC deficiency, which often does lead to death. Unfortunately, Jesse Gelsinger died at the age of 18. Jesse Gelsinger's consent to an experimental gene therapy trial was unethical due to the lack of educated consent, potential for financial bias, and inconsistencies in federal and institutional oversight. So to talk a little bit about the study that Jesse was a part of, it was initially defined to include 18 study subjects that were selected with these varying phenotypes, meaning they had different kinds of OTC deficiency. These were all adult patients with OTC, though the study was to research and develop a treatment for infantile OTC deficiency. There's a consent stage that came next, where study subjects were informed of all of the known risks and required informed consent. The study subjects then were to undergo liver and other genetic testing to make sure that they were safe for the study and that their safety was a priority. They then underwent gene therapy. So genetic material was directly injected into the hepatic artery. So a direct blood infusion of this gene therapy using the adenovirus vector, which is itself a virus that the virality is muted. So it, in theory, shouldn't infect a patient, but is just used to help aid that genetic material into the human subject's DNA. And then there's a data review at the very end, where researchers are able to review the body's response from the different subjects, the different phenotypes, with the proposed gene therapy.
And when Jesse Gelsinger agreed to sign up for the study, he had done so under the premise that volunteering could potentially help create a viable treatment for babies with a fatal form of OTC deficiency. Jesse was made fully aware that this experiment would offer little to no benefit to himself, nor to his own medical condition, at least in the immediate future. Jesse even told a close friend before starting the therapy, "I die, and it's for the babies." Unfortunately, it is still debatable as to whether Jesse Gelsinger had given sufficient information in order to make this decision to begin the therapy. We'll begin with a quote regarding lack of educated consent. Secrecy in science does not work. Withholding information does more damage to us than to our competitors. That's from physicist Edward Teller. In Jesse Gelsinger's case, there was vital information withheld, which would have potentially affected his decision. When Jesse and his family agreed to enter the trial, they were told from the doctors and from schools that the trials were safe, that they were proven through animal testing, primarily on monkeys, and that over a dozen people had already successfully undergone the treatment. The problem was there was information that was withheld, and this information was either partially false or misleading. For example, other patients in the trials had already experienced negative side effects, some of which were serious enough to have halted trials if they had been reported appropriately. There were also 2 monkeys that had died during the animal testing, and the monkeys had died due to clotting disorders, which in Jesse's case was especially dangerous to him, as he was especially susceptible to clotting disorders due to his condition. As a part of this retrial, Jesse Gelsinger died of multiple organ failure. This is the same cause of death as the monkeys that were previously unreported to Jesse. In hindsight, it's clear that the withholding of information took away Jesse Gelsinger's right to an informed consent in entering this trial. An 18-year-old and 17 at the time of starting the information to obtain the trial and more information about those trials, 18-year-old would be very reliant upon the advice of his doctors, and he'd be unable to potentially fully understand the risks of a procedure if these were not disclosed to him by his doctors. The question remains, would Jesse Gelsinger have made the same decision with complete information available to him?
One of the most alarming aspects of this case is the financial conflicts of interest that existed. Dr. James Wilson, who is the director of the Institute of Human Gene Therapy at the University of Pennsylvania, was the lead doctor on this trial. So he was also the CEO of Genovo, which was the company that would have brought this treatment to market. He had a 30% stake equity in the company, and which was valued at about $3 million. And if the trial were successful, he had about $13.5 million to gain. The University of Pennsylvania also had a conflict. They owned 5% of the company, and over the course of 5 years were due to receive $21 million in sponsored research from Genovo. And the fact is that this was not disclosed to the patients, and they had no idea that there were outside factors that could be influencing their decisions beyond the science. So I think Jesse's father said it the best. The financial conflicts of interest for both the sponsor and the university were basically ignored by the university's Conflict of Interest Committee. This led to a blindness on the part of all parties to the dangers that they were seeing. These were not bad men doing evil. These were men blinded by ambition and greed. They have told me that they could not have foreseen Jesse's death, yet their data was screaming at them to stop. We trusted in a system that was untrustworthy, one that didn't even pay attention to its own stops. It's likely that the conflicts of interest of both Dr. Wilson and the university made it difficult to make reasonable decisions regarding the study, as financial ramifications could not be separated from the scientific ones.
Whenever scientists and doctors are conducting research, they have to report to different regulatory bodies that are meant to keep the research ethical and to keep any human participant safe. In Jesse Gelsinger's case, there were 3 such bodies who reviewed the study before he participated: the RAC, the FDA, and the IRB. The RAC at that point in the 90s was under a transitionary period. They were transitioning from a capacity of review instead of complete oversight. They were down 10 members, and they were not given adjusted protocol to review when the study changed. The FDA reviewed the study after the RAC, altering the route of injection of the advector. The IRB failed to address conflict of interest issues and adverse events. They allowed enrollments of unqualified subjects, including Jesse Gelsinger, and they approved an inadequate informed consent document. In applying our class model, we found some very interesting things in the Jesse Gelsinger case. When we are looking at who benefits, the groups that benefit are the doctors and researchers, the pharmaceutical companies, and other patients down the road who may benefit from any treatment that the study produced. The groups that were harmed were Mr. Gelsinger himself, his family and loved ones, and other gene therapy researchers, as this research halted their work. The rights exercised were the rights of the doctors and researchers working on the case, the regulatory bodies reviewing the information, and Mr. Gelsinger, as he willingly chose to participate. Strangely, it's Mr. Gelsinger's rights that are also ignored, as in this case, his right to life was ignored and his right to have an informed consent.
We've expressed the moral problem as such. Is it fair, just, and right for researchers at the University of Pennsylvania to expose healthy adult volunteers for gene therapy trials that would potentially help infants born with OTC deficiency, trials that present serious and even life-threatening side effects? As we've let it be known, we don't think that it was an ethical decision to proceed, and we've cited the following reasons: that the study wouldn't actually benefit the volunteers. They were not the trial use case. Also, the conflicts of interest and the animal testing results that were not clearly disclosed or communicated, and the fact that you're asking healthy adults to expose themselves to this high degree of risk. In evaluating the economic benefits, there was not perfect information between the supply and demand sides of this market transaction. One side held all of the information while the other did not have perfect knowledge, so this was not a Pareto optimal situation. Also, the financial incentives were heavily imbalanced towards those that were administering the test and the potential benefit from having that go successfully, the monetary benefit. The volunteers were not fairly compensated for the amount of risk that they were ultimately taking on. And when we look at the legal requirements, we can see that the regulatory bodies permitted these tests to proceed, so laws were technically not broken in the administering of the tests. However, failure to disclose the results could be construed as, at best, a legal gray area, and the fact that we'll find out the legal settlement afterward came so quickly, there's definitely something there that might be illegal, or at least something that they didn't want to have go to trial. And next we'll watch a little clip to tie into our ethical duties.
Spock! Ship. Out of danger? Yes. Don't grieve, Admiral. It is logical. The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
Or the one. I never took the Kobayashi Maru test until now. What do you think of my solution?
Spock.
We've chosen to hold this case under the lens of 4 different ethical duties. As we just saw, Mr. Spock sacrifice himself for the good and safety of the crew. That really summarizes the utilitarian benefits approach here, which is the outlier of all of the ethical duties. You could argue that the sacrifice of Mr. Gelsinger was noble and could actually prevent the most harm and save thousands of infant lives per year. However, that's very results driven. The outcome would dictate whether or not that was justified. The next three duties would show the opposite. Universal duties, the researchers would likely not have volunteered for the test themselves had they known, or having been aware of all of the risks that were involved. We don't think that they would have volunteered themselves if they were candidates. Going to contributive liberty, the test deprived Mr. Gelsinger of his ultimate liberty, that being his life. And in evaluating personal virtues, the human trials lacked an open and honest disclosure, and ultimately it wasn't something that the doctors were proud of. And we have a quote here from Dr. Batshot, who was involved in the research, asking, what is the Hippocratic Oath? And after some contemplation, he says that he did harm.
So we did want to address a little bit about the future actions, and really a deep dive into how our country and how bioethics were reevaluated because of Jesse's death. So reevaluation of the adenovirus vector was prompted, and the NIH actually conducted further research into the ad vector for the transport of genetic material to humans. It was found that direct blood injection was not an ideal vector or an ideal pathway, but the ad vector itself was not found to be dangerous for humans. Gene therapy study itself, the study specifically that Jesse was a part of, was stopped. No further subjects were given gene therapy via this study or via blood transfusion. All risks were then made public and reevaluated from earlier stages of the clinical trials, as we talked about earlier in the discrepancies with the animal trials. This also prompted a lot larger bioethical issue of can we versus should we? It talks about it a little bit in the Jurassic Park clip we showed earlier. Yes, it was something that we could do, but really should we? Should we have reevaluated the ethics more of the situation before moving the study on to human trials? And really, our country was able to define utilitarian benefits of human trials and also classify who's eligible for studies such as this involving such risk. So the final impact, Jesse Gelsinger lost his life, his ultimate liberty, not to a flawed system, but instead to a flawed study design and unethical practices by physicians and researchers.